I think if you want to tell stories that are about real things, then you have to make your inspiration real. So, for instance, in Superman stories that I've done in the past, like when I did the All-Star Superman series with Frank Quitely, it was just after my father had died, so those kind of feelings went into the story, because as a writer, that's the only way you've got to articulate these feelings. You can at least make some poetic sense of grief. All of the inspiration for Superman, for Batman, for all these characters comes from things that happen in real life, and from just trying to make sense of the way people deal with each other, and the things that we all have to deal with as we go through life.
All-Star Superman by Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely is truly one of the greatest comic books I have ever read. In case you're unfamiliar with it, All-Star Superman is a 12-issue out-of-continuity story that aimed to strip down the Man of Steel to his timeless essential elements, detailing a world where Superman has only a year left to live, and both he himself and the world around him has to grapple with the hero's mortality. Published under DC Comics' fledgling All-Star label, Morrison and Quitely managed to craft a quintessential Superman tale, one that feels instantly timeless and pays homage to every Superman story that came before it, while also feeling like an incredibly fresh chapter in the life of the Man of Tomorrow. So, in this video, I want to discuss what I think makes All-Star Superman so incredible, explain some of the context and the real-world history behind it, and try to break down just what it is that makes this one of the greatest Superman stories ever told. When DC Comics first began developing the All-Star line in the early 2000s, the company was approached by acclaimed comic book writer Grant Morrison, who pitched a Superman story that would both be unlike anything that came before it, and equally a celebration of every iteration of the Man of Steel previously. Describing his pitch as a collection of timeless Superman stories, Morrison, in his own words, sought to distill everything we like about the characters into one simple package that's very much aimed at a more mainstream pop audience. The stories are intended to be universal. And I think universal really is the best way to describe All-Star Superman. Throughout its 12 issues, the comic manages to capture this timeless feel, appearing as a Superman story that pays tribute to virtually every era of the last son of Krypton, while also advancing the larger myth of this long-running character. Now, to accomplish this, Morrison sought inspiration and borrowed ideas from each of the different great Superman runs, taking elements from everyone from Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster to the Mort Weisinger Technicolor Renaissance of the 1950s comics, to John Byrne's 1986 reboot, and all the way up to the then present day Superman comics. By doing this, All-Star Superman sought to demonstrate a common identity throughout each iteration of the character, and showcase the core essential elements of what Superman really is. As Grant Morrison recalls, what struck me wasn't the differences in all these approaches. They were all very different, but the similarities. He barely has the same personality from one issue to the next sometimes, and yet, no matter who is writing the stories, some essential archetypical Superman always remains intact, and it's that primal core, that soul of Superman, that we're putting onto the pages of All-Star. Bringing Morrison's grand idea to life was certainly no easy feat. The writer had tasked himself with not only writing what could be the final tale in an 80-plus year epic, but also a story that would feel like a natural evolution to every version of Superman that had came before, while also being an accessible and familiar read to those who might be unfamiliar with Superman's extended lore. To say that crafting a story that could achieve these expectations was tough is somewhat of an understatement, but as Morrison and Frank Quitely began to bring their vision to life in late 2005, there would be very little doubt amongst the comic book world that they were truly witnessing something special. How does someone go about telling the final ever Superman story? Just saying that aloud sounds incredibly daunting, but it's a concept that has only been handled a couple of times in the past. Alan Moore, in his 1986 story, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, told the final story of the Golden Age Superman, with John Byrne rebooting the character following Crisis on Infinite Earths thereafter. Then there's the infamous 1992 Death of Superman event, written by the likes of Dan Jurgens, Jerry Ordway and Louise Simonson, and then the most recent Peter Tomasi send-off to the short-lived New 52 version of The Man of Steel in the final days of Superman. While all of these are fascinating attempts at concluding the story of this long-running character, none of them quite compare to the sense of humanity and relatability that All-Star Superman excels in. All-Star Superman is a story all about mortality and learning to come to terms with the idea of death. Partly inspired by the real-life loss of his father to cancer in early 2004, Morrison imagined a world where even the most powerful being on the planet had to grapple with his own mortality. The Cliff Notes pitch of All-Star Superman, "What if Superman got cancer?" is itself a fascinating premise for a comic book. But I think it's in the execution and the larger questions that Morrison and artist Frank Quitely ask within the nuances of this plot that makes All-Star Superman one of the greatest comic book stories ever told. All-Star Superman takes place over 12 issues, detailing the Man of Steel's final year on Earth. At the beginning of the story, Clark discovers that he is slowly dying, his cells being poisoned by radiation, and the comic essentially turns these subsequent issues into an extremely personal look into the life of Clark Kent, and how both he himself and those around him begin to come to terms with his looming death. The comic deconstructs and recontextualizes the relationships that Superman has built with virtually all of the usual supporting cast, questioning how a world built around the Man of Tomorrow would respond when tomorrow was no longer a guarantee. In particular, All-Star examines Clark's relationships with three main characters: Lois Lane, Jonathan Kent, and Lex Luthor. From the very first issue of the series, we see how the news of Superman's illness changes his relationship with Lois, with issue 1 ending with Clark rushing home to Lois's apartment, ripping open his dress shirt and revealing his secret identity. With time now of the essence, Superman forgoes the secret identity cliché, instead choosing to let his guard down and show Lois the real person beneath them. This is best demonstrated in issue 3, where Clark creates a chemical that allows someone to obtain his powers for a day, using it to spend Lois's birthday, soaring through the skies and fighting crime as a couple. Not only does this issue offer us a great personal insight into Clark and his love for Lois, but it also serves a crucial role in the larger narrative at play, as Superman lets Lois Lane experience the world the way he does every day, meaning that even after he's gone, someone will understand exactly what being Superman means and what it is, as Clark would later go on to write in his will in issue 10, "To Lois Lane, I leave our future." Likewise, Superman's relationship with his adopted father also plays a key role throughout this story. Issue 6 in particular is a flashback to the pair's life on Kent Farm, examining how Jonathan and Martha Kent's nurture shaped Clark into the hero that he would become. The story in this issue is fantastical in nature, with several Supermen from the future arriving to enlist the young Clark to help fight the Chronovore. The Chronovore is a being that eats time, and as Clark fights alongside his future heroes, Jonathan suffers a heart attack, with the time it takes for Clark to fly back to the farm and be there with his late father taken away by the monster. Jonathan Kent dies, and it's in this moment that Clark learns that despite his extraordinary abilities, he can't always save everyone. Clark delivers a speech at the funeral that reaffirms the importance of Jonathan's fatherhood and the lessons that he's taught him, stating that, "He taught me that the strong have to stand up for the weak. He showed me by example how to be tough, and how to be kind, and how to dream of a better world." While both of these aspects of the book comment on how Superman changes the world, and how the world in turn changes Superman, I think it's the relationship between Clark and Lex Luthor that All-Star Superman is at its most interesting thematically. At the start of the comic, Lex is sentenced to death for crimes against humanity, with his ticking clock mirroring that of Superman's. And while Clark is initially fearful of death, scared of what the world will become without Superman, Lex appears completely unfazed, if anything confident in his legacy of the man who killed Superman. There are 2 issues of All-Star that focus on Superman and Lex's relationship, issue 5 and the final issue 12. Issue 5 is centred around Clark interviewing Lex before his execution, with the villain explaining his hatred of Superman and the philosophical differences between them, with Lex arguing that he could have been the hero that the world looks up to, if not for the arrival of an all-good and all-powerful alien overshadowing his achievements. But I think it's in the final issue where Morrison fully deconstructs the pair's relationship and gives us the best explanation of what makes Superman and Lex so morally different. In this issue, Lex obtains the chemical that Superman created to gift his powers, at a time where Clark's radiated cells bring him close to death. Ambushing the Daily Planet offices, it seems like nobody can stop Lex Luthor, but instead, something interesting happens. Superman's powers begin to overwhelm Lex, and he begins to see the world around him differently, the way Clark does. Lex, always someone obsessed with the individual, perceives a world where all living things, be they human, Kryptonian or other, are connected. It shakes Lex to his core and brings him to tears. And this is where Morrison explains the differences between these 2 characters perfectly, as Superman tells Lex that you could have saved the world years ago if it mattered to you. It was never about the powers or the extraordinary abilities. What makes Superman such an incredible hero is his humanity, and the morals that his parents instilled within him from a young age. It's here that Morrison sums up something that's clear throughout the entire comic. He may be Kryptonian in blood, but Superman is more human than any of us, and it's in these final moments as Clark comes to terms with his impending death that the human core of this fantastical hero is displayed for all to see. For all its high concepts and its fantastical elements, All-Star Superman tells, ultimately, an incredibly human story about an incredibly human character. There truly aren't the words for me to convey just how brilliant I think All-Star Superman is. The story that Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely tell throughout these 12 incredible issues feels like the quintessential Superman story, one that understands and embraces all that came before it, and channels it into a new level, creating a truly definitive Superman tale. Every issue of this story shows us a very real and relatable look at an otherwise godlike hero, bringing Superman out of the clouds and firmly down to our level. And I think it's somewhat ironic that the comic's ending, which is unquestionably fantastical and extraordinary in tone, is what really reaffirms this relatable sentiment of humanity and mortality. The end of All-Star Superman sees Clark face off against Solaris, the tyrant sun, in a battle that ultimately damages the centre of the sun. As the only being strong enough to withstand the heat and the radiation, despite his increasingly irradiated cells, Superman says one final goodbye to Lois Lane and flies off to repair the sun and build it an artificial heart. Now, this sounds like a very over-the-top ending to what's thematically a grounded story, but All-Star is wacky and fantastical throughout, because it's that blend of fantasy and relatability that makes Superman who he is. When Clark flies off into space to repair the sun, a task that will take the hero 10,000 years, and eventually mutate his irradiated cells into a godlike status of being, quite literally becoming All-Star, he leaves behind a world that believes that Superman is dead, and is ready in his wake to carry on his message. This is demonstrated both literally in Star Lab's creation of a Superman 2 clone, and in a more symbolic sense of a world touched by Superman's presence. Whether that be Lois Lane, who got to experience the world in the same way that Clark did every day, or anyone else who felt a connection to the hero, Clark leaves behind a world where his ideals will be carried on for long after any single lifetime. And that right there is the ultimate legacy. Legacy plays a huge part of All-Star Superman. As Clark leaves to fulfill work at the centre of the sun, the message and the meaning of Superman becomes eternal. To sum the entire comic book up into a single idea, I think that Morrison is trying to say that even when the physical reminders of those we love are no longer here with us, the world we inhabit will always contain a trace of them, because in some small way, Each of us changes the world, and for as long as there is good in the world, there will always be Superman. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on the video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on All-Star Superman by Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about it, as always. If you're new to Owen Likes Comics, please consider hitting the subscribe button and the notify bell so you don't miss any new video we release. And there should be some other videos on screen right now that you might also enjoy if you enjoyed this one. If you want some more of me, you can follow me on Twitter just at Owen Likes Comics, and if you want to support the channel, you can do so at Patreon. There'll be a link in the description and also on the screen as well. That's all for me. I will see you all next time, so until then, take care and keep reading.